Jackson Shaw sat in his worn leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in hand, the local newspaper folded on the table in front of him. The headline screamed of political scandals and corporate conspiracies, but Shaw no longer cared. He had distanced himself from the legal chaos almost 3 years ago, after a nervous breakdown that forced him to leave his prestigious position as a prosecutor. A mix of stress, guilt, and a case that consumed him had pushed him to the edge of sanity. But the past was about to catch up with him again. It was a cold, rainy afternoon when the phone rang. He hesitated for a moment, eyeing the device as if it were an enemy he was trying to avoid. Since he had retired, calls had been rare. With a sigh, he picked up the phone. Shaw, his voice was rough, as if it hadn't been used in days. Mr. Shaw? My name is Heather Lee, I'm a private investigator. I need your help. It's about the Morton case. The name made Shaw fall silent for a moment. Richard Morton. The case that brought him down. He had promised himself he would never think of that name again. That trial had been the final nail in his coffin, the murder case that destroyed him. But Heather continued, ignoring his hesitation. I believe the case was tampered with, sir. There are more people involved than we thought. Sorry, I can't help you, he replied curtly, already preparing to hang up. The weight of that name was a burden he didn't want to carry again. Wait, please. I found something. Evidence that was never presented. If you don't want to help me, fine, but at least let me show it to you. Something's very wrong, and no one wants to investigate. Her voice carried a tone of urgency, almost desperation. Shaw ran a hand through his graying hair, fighting off the memories of that case. Something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she spoke, or maybe it was the empty whiskey glass in his hand, clouding his self-preservation instincts. He knew he should hang up, but he couldn't. Meet me tomorrow, at 2, he said before hanging up. He leaned back, taking a deep breath. For a second, the sound of the rain seemed distant, muffled by the memories rushing back with full force. Richard Morton, the businessman accused of killing a young journalist, had been found guilty. Shaw had been sure of his guilt at the time. But something didn't add up now. Something that, though buried in the past, was starting to bubble to the surface. Night fell slowly over Shaw's house, and he went to sleep without realizing it would be his last night of peace. Tomorrow, the past would begin to consume him once again. Heather Lee's coffee was almost untouched when Shaw entered the small diner. She was younger than he had imagined, maybe in her early 30s, with eyes that seemed to have seen more than they should have. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Shaw walked over to the table in silence, sitting across from her. I thought you wouldn't come, she said, pushing a brown envelope toward him. Shaw didn't respond immediately. His eyes studied the investigator with the same precision a lawyer uses when examining a witness in court. She seemed tense, and it wasn't just because of the rain falling outside. There was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, but that unsettled him deeply. What's this? He asked, pointing to the envelope. Heather hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. It's a recording, she said. An audio made 2 days before Rachel Turner's murder. Rachel Turner. Shaw remembered the name. She was an investigative journalist who had been brutally murdered. At the time, the Morton case seemed clear. All the evidence pointed to him, a powerful businessman who had a public altercation with the journalist just days before the crime. Shaw had led the prosecution with fierce conviction. Morton was sentenced to life in prison. Shaw picked up the envelope, hesitant. This should have been part of the case file, he said, without opening it. If it's authentic, it should have been used during the trial. Why is it only coming up now? Because no one wanted it to come up. I was working for a defense attorney at the time, conducting parallel investigations. When I found this recording, I was told to forget it. They said the case was already settled, that Morton was guilty. But I couldn't let it go. After you stepped away, I kept digging, and I found this. Shaw looked at Heather, trying to understand why she was bringing this up now. It felt odd. He had been the target of numerous attempts to reopen past cases, most of them by lawyers trying to reduce sentences. But this felt different. She wasn't here looking for a favor. There was something more. And what exactly did you find? He asked, finally opening the envelope. Inside, there was a small recording device. Shaw picked it up and examined it for a few seconds before pressing the play button. Static filled the air for a moment, until a familiar male voice emerged. It doesn't matter what you do. This has to disappear. I can't risk letting this get out. Not now, with so many people involved. There was a pause, and then another voice, this time a woman's, joined the conversation. But this is dangerous. We're talking about powerful people. If they find out, they could destroy us. Shaw's heart raced. He recognized the male voice. It was Richard Morton. But the female voice, it wasn't Rachel Turner. "I found this recording in the defense attorney's files," Heather explained, while Shaw still processed what he had heard. The woman Morton was talking to was never identified. And the strangest part, this was recorded 2 days before the murder. He knew something was coming. Shaw switched off the recorder. Not yet. But there's a pattern here, something bigger than just a murder. Morton's voice, he doesn't sound like someone talking about an isolated crime. It feels more like a conspiracy, something involving a lot of people. Shaw leaned back, feeling the weight of the recording and what it meant. Something wasn't right, and maybe it never had been. He didn't know who to trust anymore, not even himself. But whatever this was, he was already too involved. "Morton is serving life in prison," Shaw said, more to himself than to Heather. If this recording is real, maybe he wasn't working alone. Someone out there is still free. Heather nodded slowly, her eyes meeting Shaw's. "That's why I need your help. No one is going to investigate this, no one wants to reopen the case. But if you get involved, they'll listen." Shaw sat in silence for a long moment. He knew what this meant. Once he took the first step, there would be no turning back. The past was about to crash into the present in ways he hadn't expected. Deep down, he knew he'd never truly escape this shadow. "Okay," he finally said. "I'll help you figure out who really killed Rachel Turner." Heather's face lit up for a second before returning to its usual calm expression. "But Heather," Shaw added, his tone serious, "don't trust anyone. Not even me." 2 days had passed since his meeting with Heather, and Shaw was already completely absorbed in the case. The recording kept playing in his mind, and the unknown woman's voice only heightened his suspicion that something much larger was lurking behind what seemed like a simple murder. At that moment, he was in the old office of his colleague Frank Lyman, who still worked at the DA's office. It was late, the building was almost empty, and the flickering fluorescent light in Frank's office made the atmosphere even more oppressive. "You know this case destroyed me, Frank," Shaw began, holding the recording in his hands. "I want to believe I didn't lose my career for nothing. That Morton really was guilty." Frank looked at Shaw over his glasses, his face stern but showing a trace of compassion. "The case was solid, Jackson. I was there. Morton had his trial. He was convicted on consistent evidence." "Too consistent," Shaw replied, placing the recording on the table. "But what if the evidence was tampered with? What if someone wanted Morton out of the way, or needed him to take the fall for something he didn't do alone?" Frank frowned, eyeing the recorder like it was a cursed artifact. "What are you trying to say? That someone else was involved?" He sounded skeptical, but Shaw could tell Frank's interest was growing. "This is dangerous, Jackson. You're digging into something that's already been buried. No one's going to want this case reopened." Shaw knew Frank was right. He felt the same weight. But there was something he couldn't ignore anymore. Heather had mentioned more people were involved, and the recording seemed to back that up. "I just want you to listen," Shaw said at last. He pressed play. Once again, Morton's voice filled the room. The words, now familiar, sounded even more threatening in the quiet space. "This has to disappear. Powerful people." The recording ended, and Frank sat in silence for a long time, rubbing his chin, deep in thought. "Why didn't you bring this up during the trial?" he asked, suspicious. "Because it was never delivered. It was hidden." Frank shook his head, standing up and pacing around the room. "Jackson, you know what you're implying, right?" He stopped and looked directly at Shaw. "If someone else is involved, if there's a conspiracy, this could go far beyond Morton. You're talking about people with real power." "That's exactly why I'm here," Shaw replied. "You still have contacts. I need access to the original case files, the unused evidence, the transcripts of the interrogations. I need to see everything again." Frank sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the request. "Jackson, I can't just hand those things over. There are protocols, and this could destroy what's left of your reputation." Shaw stood up, knowing full well he was asking for something dangerous, but he was resolute. "I'm not letting this go, Frank. Someone's been playing us from the start. Morton was just a pawn. I need to understand the game before it destroys me again." Frank stared at him for a long moment before reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a key. "The Morton case file is stored in the archives, level 2. If you get caught down there?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It won't be easy to get out of this. But if you think it's worth it, you can try." Shaw took the key and left without saying a word. With each step through the empty hallway, the tension mounted. He knew he was crossing a line from which there was no turning back. When he reached the basement of the prosecutor's office, where old case files were stored, an unsettling feeling crept over him. The place was dark and damp, with rusted metal shelves stacked with boxes of cases from decades past. He found the homicide section, and after a few minutes of searching, located the box labeled Richard Morton. He took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside were all the case materials, forensic reports, witness transcripts, recordings, crime scene photos, but one folder, thinner than the others, caught his attention. It was a dossier he had never seen before. Shaw started flipping through the documents, and his heart raced. There were testimonies that had never been presented in court. And among them, something alarming, a surveillance report indicating that, 2 days before Rachel Turner's murder, a secret meeting had taken place between Morton and a high-ranking political figure, a name Shaw never expected to see associated with the case. Senator Marshall Gaines. A chill ran down Shaw's spine. Gaines was a political legend, known for being untouchable. And now, his name was directly linked to the Morton case. What the hell is going on here? Shaw muttered to himself. Before he could fully process the discovery, he heard a noise behind him. His instincts sharpened. Someone else was in the archive. He quickly put the documents back in the box and turned off the light. His heart pounded as footsteps approached. Whoever it was, they were there for a reason. Shaw held his breath, listening carefully as the person moved through the archive. The rustling of boxes being sifted through caught his attention. Someone was searching for something. For a moment, Shaw considered stepping out and confronting whoever it was, but he knew that wouldn't be the smartest move. He needed time to process what he had just uncovered. Senator Marshall Gaines' name connected to the Morton case changed everything. But why? And how was he involved in Rachel Turner's murder? He waited. The intruder seemed to be checking the same section of files where Shaw had been, but after a few minutes, the sound of footsteps began to fade. Shaw didn't emerge from his hiding spot until absolute silence returned to the basement. The person was gone. He approached the box again, grabbed the thin folder, and stuffed it into his jacket. Now, more than ever, he needed to get out of there without being seen. With adrenaline coursing through him, Shaw hurried up the stairs and exited through the back door of the building. The heavy rain that poured down that night helped cover his escape. Once inside his car, Shaw pulled out the folder and began flipping through the documents. The surveillance report was detailed, mentioning that Morton and Senator Gaines had met at a discreet hotel, with no visible security present. The report also suggested that Gaines had influenced Morton's trial, ensuring that he was swiftly convicted without too much media exposure. The senator seemed to be playing both sides. And now, it was clear that Morton hadn't acted alone. But why was Gaines involved? What secrets were being protected? Shaw drove to his apartment, his mind swirling with the implications of this new discovery. He knew he was dealing with something dangerous. If Gaines was involved, this wasn't just a game of power between lawyers and businessmen. It was something much bigger: politics, corruption, and who knew what else. As soon as he got home, Shaw threw his jacket onto the couch and poured himself another glass of whiskey. While he drank, he called Heather Lee. "Shaw?" Her voice sounded groggy. It was late, and he could hear the rain in the background. "Heather, we've got a problem. Or maybe an opportunity. The Morton case is a lot bigger than we thought." "What did you find?" Her voice immediately became alert. "Marshall Gaines. He's involved. I found a surveillance report that links him directly to Morton. The two met 2 days before Rachel Turner's murder." "Senator Gaines?" she almost whispered, in disbelief. This is serious, Shaw. If this is true, we're dealing with some very powerful people." "Yes," Shaw replied, watching the rain pour down outside his window. "And someone's already on our trail. I was followed at the archives today. Someone was looking for the same thing I was." "That means we're close to something big," Heather said, a mix of excitement and fear in her voice. "But we need to be careful. If Gaines is involved, he won't hesitate to take out anyone who tries to expose this." Shaw knew she was right. He was taking a huge risk. But at the same time, he felt a sense of purpose again. The feeling of being back in control of an investigation, of uncovering something that could change everything, made him feel alive. "I want you to find everything you can on Gaines," he said. "Contacts, business deals, anything that ties him to Morton or Turner. We need to figure out what's really going on here." Heather agreed and hung up. Shaw finished his whiskey and sank into the couch, the weight of everything he'd uncovered so far pressing down on him. There was a larger conspiracy at play, a web of power and corruption he was just beginning to understand. And the most dangerous question still remained: why did Rachel Turner have to die? He knew he was getting involved in something dark, something that could completely destroy his life. But at this point, there was no turning back. He needed to know the truth, even if it took him back to the place that had nearly destroyed him years ago. As he closed his eyes, images of Gaines and Morton conspiring filled his mind. He knew this was only the beginning, and the real twist was yet to come. The next morning, as Shaw mentally reviewed his next steps, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Shaw, we need to talk," a man's raspy voice came from the other end of the line. "It's about what you uncovered last night." Shaw's heart froze. "Who is this?" "Someone who's been watching you closely. You're playing with fire, Shaw. If you keep going, you're going to get burned." The line went dead. Shaw stared at the phone in silence, the weight of the unknown man's warning sinking in. "You're playing with fire." He knew, from that moment on, he couldn't trust anyone. Yet, the urge to push forward was stronger than the fear. He had already crossed the line, and turning back wasn't an option. After a quick shower, Shaw drove to Heather's office, feeling the eyes of strangers watching him as he passed through the streets. Every movement seemed suspicious, every passing car a potential threat. When he finally entered Heather's small office, she was already hunched over a pile of documents, dark circles under her eyes. "Anything new?" he asked, shutting the door behind him. Heather looked up, her exhaustion evident in her sunken eyes. "I followed your lead on Marshall Gaines. What I found is terrifying." She slid a dossier across the table toward Shaw. "Gaines isn't just any politician. He's connected to shell companies, charitable foundations, and the judicial system." "The judicial system?" Shaw asked, picking up the dossier. "Yes," Heather continued. "Look at this. The same judge who presided over Morton's case used to work on projects funded by one of Gaines' charitable institutions. He was appointed with Gaines' direct influence. This isn't a coincidence, Shaw. Gaines orchestrated everything." Shaw skimmed through the documents. It was undeniable. Financial transactions between Gaines' companies and the judge who handled Morton's case were all there, masked as generous donations and investments. This explained why Morton's conviction had been so swift and unquestioned. "This is a lot bigger than I ever imagined," Shaw murmured, more to himself than to Heather. "And there's more," she said, leaning in with a grave expression. "Rachel Turner was investigating these connections when she was murdered. She was about to expose everything." That revelation made Shaw freeze for a moment. The journalist who was killed, she knew. And that's why she had to be silenced. Gaines had Rachel Turner killed to cover up what she was about to uncover, Shaw said, piecing it together. And Morton was in it up to his neck. He knew everything. But his conviction was orchestrated to keep attention away from the real mastermind. Heather nodded. "Exactly. Morton was sacrificed to protect something much bigger. And now that you're digging into it, they're starting to move." Before Shaw could respond, Heather's phone rang. She answered quickly, but her expression turned serious almost immediately. She stood up, hanging up the phone in a rush. "We need to get out of here," she said, grabbing her coat. "Now." Shaw didn't argue. He grabbed the dossier and followed Heather toward the exit. As they descended the stairs, the sound of screeching tires made them pause for a moment. A black car with tinted windows was parked across the street, clearly watching them. "They're here," Heather whispered. "They found us." Shaw's heart pounded. They rushed toward the building's back exit, trying to avoid any direct confrontation. But as they slipped down a side street, they heard the heavy footsteps behind them. Without looking back, Shaw and Heather ran. They ducked into a narrow alley, their breathing labored, until they found an exit onto the main street. The city traffic seemed like a blessing, concealing them among the crowd. "We need to find somewhere safe," Heather said, panting. "They won't stop until we're silenced." Shaw agreed, but his mind was racing a step ahead. Whoever was chasing them wasn't just some low-level thug. These were professionals, likely sent by Gaines or someone even higher up. That meant their time was running out. They hailed a cab and headed to the only place Shaw thought they might find some protection, Frank Lyman's house. When they arrived, Shaw knocked frantically on the door. After a few seconds, Frank answered, his expression tightening as he saw the two standing there. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, pulling them inside. Shaw quickly explained what had happened, the chase, how close they were to uncovering something massive involving Gaines. Frank stared at them in silence for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "If you've gotten this far, then you've really stirred up a hornet's nest. Marshall Gaines is untouchable, Shaw. He has control over more things than you realize. You two are in the way of something extremely dangerous." "We don't have a choice," Heather said, her eyes locked on Frank. "We're already in this too deep. The only way we're getting out alive is by exposing the truth." Frank frowned, thinking for a moment before heading to a drawer in his office. He pulled out a sealed envelope. "This arrived for me yesterday," he said, handing the envelope to Shaw. "It's a subpoena for a secret deposition. They want me to testify about the Morton case, but it doesn't make sense. No one should be reopening that case. Unless it's to bury everything for good." Shaw opened the envelope, and as he read the contents, his stomach churned. "Looks like someone's trying to put an end to this," he muttered, passing the document to Heather. Time was running out. And the secret hearing Frank mentioned could be the final piece of the puzzle. But there was something else, something Shaw was beginning to realize. He looked at Frank, and a troubling doubt started to form in his mind. Were they really all on the same side? Frank, who else knows we're here? Shaw asked, his voice lower now. Frank hesitated for a second before answering. No one. Why? Shaw took a deep breath. There was a strange tension in the air. Something didn't feel right. Why do I have the feeling we're about to be betrayed? The silence that followed Shaw's statement was oppressive. Heather glanced from Frank to Shaw, trying to understand the sudden tension that filled the room. Frank Lyman crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes, his expression hardening. Betrayed? Frank asked, his voice low and controlled. Are you saying I would sell you out? Shaw kept his gaze steady, his instincts screaming that something was off. Over the years in the courtroom, he had learned to read people, to detect that subtle change in tone or expression that indicated someone was hiding something. And Frank, his old friend, seemed to be hiding far more than just simple secrets. I want to believe you wouldn't, Frank, Shaw replied calmly. But ever since we started investigating, things have spiraled out of control fast. Morton, Gaines, this whole conspiracy, and now, a court subpoena? Someone's pulling the strings, and that person knows way too much. Heather began to sense the heavy atmosphere and took a step back, watching the exchange of looks between the two men. Shaw, what are you implying? She asked cautiously. Shaw closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. Someone up top is trying to shut everything down, and fast. We're dangerously close to the truth, but it seems like every time we take a step forward, they're already ready to silence us. Gaines, Morton, the judge, this isn't just any conspiracy. We're dealing with something far more dangerous. Frank remained silent, his face impassive, but Shaw knew he was thinking quickly. He was caught between his loyalty to a friend and the larger forces controlling the fate of all of them. I gave you the keys to access the files, Shaw. If I were against you, I never would have done that, Frank argued, his voice laced with genuine frustration. Shaw looked at him for a long moment, evaluating every word, every gesture. He knew Frank was involved, but he still couldn't see how deep it went. Something about his behavior had been off from the start. The sudden cooperation, the information he'd facilitated. It could all be a trap, but Shaw still couldn't piece it all together. That doesn't mean you're not working for them, Shaw muttered, the tension rising. Heather, sensing the gravity of the situation, stepped in before things could escalate further. Wait, she said, raising her hands. We need answers, not more distrust. Frank, if you really want to help us, we need complete honesty. Who else knows about this subpoena? And why do you think they're calling you to testify now, after all this time? Frank rubbed his forehead, clearly exhausted from the pressure the situation was putting on him. Finally, he sank into the couch, letting out a heavy sigh. I don't know who else is involved, but this subpoena, he hesitated, seeming to struggle with his words. It was delivered directly by a contact from the Department of Justice, someone I hadn't seen in years. He told me it would be a delicate matter, that everything needed to be done in secret. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now. Shaw felt his stomach turn. A direct contact from the DOJ? That only made it clearer that everything was being manipulated from the inside. Frank, listen, Shaw said firmly. If you go through with this secret trial, they're going to use you as a scapegoat. They need someone to take the fall to cover up for Gaines and everything he's been doing. Frank looked at Shaw, visibly shaken. He had always been a pragmatic man, but now he was facing something far bigger than just political intrigues. And if I don't go? Frank asked quietly. They can destroy me either way. They're already destroying you, Shaw responded, resolute. But we have a chance. We need to turn the tables before they finish setting up this trap. And that means exposing Gaines now, before he moves the final pieces. Heather nodded, knowing time was running out. We have something strong enough to tie him to Morton and Rachel Turner's murder. She looked at Shaw. But how are we going to do it? Gaines controls the media, the judicial system. He'll crush any attempt we make. Shaw looked at them both, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. The only way out was a bold move, something that would force Gaines into the open and expose him publicly. They needed undeniable proof, and Shaw knew where to find it. The surveillance report links Gaines to the murder, but it's not enough to bring down a man like him. We need something more, something definitive. He turned to Heather. Where's the recorder you showed me? The one with Morton's voice and that unknown woman? Heather pulled the recorder from her bag, handing it to Shaw. Here it is. Do you think this could be the key? Shaw stared at the device for a long moment before answering. Yes, but we need more. We need to identify this woman. If we can prove she was directly involved in the murder and that she was acting under Gaines' orders, then, we've got a chance. Heather nodded, while Frank remained silent, battling his own demons. I'll handle this, Shaw said, standing up. Frank, I need you to stay out of the spotlight for now. If you testify, it could be the end. They'll use you. Frank shook his head, clearly shaken, but agreed. And you? Heather asked, walking with Shaw to the door. He paused for a moment, looking her in the eyes with a determination he hadn't felt in years. I'm going to find this woman. And when I do, Gaines will have nowhere to hide. But deep down, Shaw knew he was racing against time. Every move now was a race against the powerful forces slowly closing in on them. And the twist he feared the most was still yet to come. Shaw spent the night wide awake, his eyes glued to the notes he had made. The recording of Morton arguing with the unknown woman was the only piece that could unravel the entire structure Gaines had built. But the clock was ticking. Heather was investigating every possible connection, but without a name, without the woman's identity, Gaines would remain untouchable. The next morning, Shaw decided to take the risk. He knew the answer was closer than he had thought, and that meant going back to the place he least wanted to, the prison where Morton was serving his sentence. If anyone knew who this woman was, it was Richard Morton. As he entered the maximum security prison, Shaw felt the weight of his decision. His hands were steady, but his heart pounded with a mix of adrenaline and uncertainty. Morton had always been a controlling, calculating figure. Now, sentenced to life in prison, he was a broken man, but Shaw knew he still held on to secrets. The visitation room was cold and silent. When Morton was brought in, he was almost unrecognizable. The once powerful businessman was now aged, with slumped shoulders and vacant eyes. Shaw sat across from him, observing every detail. Shaw, Morton said, his voice raspy, a faint smile of bitterness on his lips. I thought we'd never meet again. Shaw didn't smile. I need answers, Morton. And you're going to give them to me. Morton tilted his head, his eyes flickering with a brief spark of interest. Interesting. You don't look like the broken man I expected. What do you want? What brings you here after all this time? Shaw pulled the recorder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. Remember this? Shaw asked, pressing play. Morton listened, and for a moment, his face hardened. But soon, the bitter smile returned. Of course I remember. But tell me, Shaw, what do you think you can do with this? You're digging your own grave. Shaw leaned forward, his eyes locked on Morton. Who is the woman on the recording? Morton let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Ah, yes. That? I wonder how long you've been chasing that shadow. What do you think you're going to find? Her name, Morton. That's all I need. Shaw's voice was firm, but he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. She was with you before Rachel Turner was killed. You didn't do it alone, and I know Gaines was involved. At the mention of the senator, Morton froze. His smile slowly faded, and a shadow crossed his face. Gaines, Morton repeated, almost whispering. You don't get it, do you? Gaines is just a pawn. And when you start pulling the thread, you'll find he's tangled in something much bigger. Shaw narrowed his eyes, suspicious. Then explain it to me. Who's behind all of this? Morton glanced around, making sure no one was listening, before leaning closer to Shaw. They used me. Just like they're going to use you. The woman you're trying to find? She's untouchable. No one can get to her because she doesn't exist in any official records. She was created to cover up what's really going on. Name. Shaw's voice was low but sharp. Who is she? Morton hesitated, his expression now torn between fear and resignation. Diana Clark. Morton's voice came out in a whisper. She was the go-between, the shadow that did Gaines' dirty work. But she was also working for someone else, someone you're not ready to face. Shaw froze. Diana Clark. The name finally had a face. But what Morton said next made his blood run cold. And if you think you can expose Gaines with this, you're dead wrong. Because Diana's hands are dirty with another name. Frank Lyman. The ground seemed to fall out from under Shaw. Frank? His friend, the man who helped him access the files, had been involved all along? Was that why the secret trial was being rushed? Morton continued. Frank always worked in the shadows. He facilitated the schemes, the judicial manipulations. He ensured I was convicted without anyone questioning it. And now, if you're not careful, he'll make sure you're silenced before you can do anything. Shaw rose slowly, his mind spinning. Frank had been the traitor all along. Not just a traitor, but one of the architects behind the corruption involving Gaines and possibly more. You can run, Shaw, Morton said with a grim smile. But they're already watching you. Diana, Gaines, Frank, they'll get you, just like they got Rachel. Leaving the prison, Shaw felt his stomach churn. It all made sense now, Frank's DOJ contact, the subpoena, the sudden twists in the case. Frank Lyman had been manipulating everything from the start, playing both sides. And Diana Clark, the untouchable woman, was the final key. Shaw knew what he had to do, but time was running out. He grabbed his phone and called Heather. I found the woman's name. Diana Clark. And Frank, he's on their side, Heather. We've been played this whole time. The silence on the other end was sharp. Frank? Heather asked, shocked. No, that can't be. It can. And it is. Shaw gripped the steering wheel, tension surging through him. We need to expose them all at once. Diana Clark, Gaines, and Frank. And we have to do it now, before the secret trial happens. Heather exhaled deeply. I can get this to the media, but you need to move fast. The trial's tomorrow. If Frank gets what he wants, we're finished. Shaw knew there was no turning back. It was all or nothing. I'm going to Frank's house now. Find everything you can on Diana. We need to take all three down together. As he hung up, Shaw felt the weight of the moment. He was about to face the greatest enemy of his career, someone he'd trusted for years, who was now about to destroy everything. Frank Lyman was the true traitor. And the twist Shaw had dreaded was finally revealed. But he was ready for the final showdown. Imagine yourself in Jackson Shaw's shoes, discovering that the person you trusted the most had been manipulating you from the start. What would you do if the system you believed was meant to protect you was, in reality, a carefully orchestrated fraud? Would you still risk everything to expose the truth, knowing that the price might be your own life? Or would you give in to the pressure, accepting silence in exchange for your safety? In this legal thriller, Shaw faces a complex moral dilemma: fight against powerful enemies and uncover a corrupt system, or protect his own survival. But what about you? If you were in his position, would you have the courage to challenge the powerful? How far would you go to achieve justice? Tell us what you would do in this web of betrayal and conspiracy. Don't miss the next episode of this explosive storyline. And, of course, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for the next shocking revelations that will leave you breathless.